In today's video, I'm comparing 3 of the best mid-range hybrid cameras on the market today. The Canon R6 MKII, the Sony A7IV, and the brand new Lumix S5 MKII. In photo, I'll compare colours and resolution in both portraits and landscape photography to see if the 30 megapixels in the Sony is really noticeable up against the 24 megapixels in the Canon and the Lumix. We're also going to be taking a quick look at things like low light and dynamic range in photo too. In video, we're going to compare 4K 25 and 4K 50p in terms of image quality, as well as taking a look at things like stabilization and low light performance and much more. As always, I'm going to be sharing the raw photo and video files from this comparison so you can download them and see the differences for yourself. We've got a lot to get through, so let's get started on the photo side with portraits. So let's kick off the comparison outdoors in the city for some natural light portraits. A great way to see the colour differences between the cameras, as well as see if we can spot that resolution difference. All 3 cameras look great, with the Canon being consistently a bit warmer than the others. The Sony, I would say, is probably the more true to life, but not as flattering straight out of camera. I always love Lumix colours, but I did find the skin tones on the S5 II very magenta. Moving into some more close-up shots, again I feel the Canon is the most flattering off the bat, but honestly it would literally take you seconds to correct any of the colour related issues with any of these cameras and get them matching up really quick. Taking a closer look, even at this close of a crop, I don't think you can really notice extra resolution on the Sony image. And I really like the micro contrast on the Canon, but that's probably mostly down to the lens. So let's move into a more controlled environment and take some studio headshots on each camera at an f8 aperture to remove any issue with lenses. All the earlier observations on colour carry on over into the studio, but all 3 still look great and match up nicely. Zooming in on the eye considerably does reveal that advantage in resolution for the Sony. It's pretty apparent in the model's eyebrow, for example, which is cleaner and sharper compared to the Canon and Lumix and is just capturing a little more detail. You do have to pixel peep to an absurd amount really to see this advantage though, but it is there. Now I have to say, getting these shots was not a fun experience on the Sony. I had a consistent issue with the Sony where it just would seem to constantly front focus. You can see in these images the right eye is in focus but the left eye is not. Here's another worse example, and despite the camera telling me it was focusing on the eye, it's actually out of focus and the model's ring in front of the eye is in focus. This was really frustrating as it ruined a lot of images and I couldn't really tell that this was going on when looking at the back of the camera. So I'm out in Malham and I've found this lone tree on these kind of limestone sheets. So I'm going to take this opportunity to try each of the cameras in a kind of landscape situation using the Canon, the Sony and the Lumix. Take a look at colour, dynamic range and of course general resolution. All 3 cameras captured this contrasty dynamic scene really well, but in terms of colour and dynamic range, the Sony really stood out to me here. I just love the colours, it seems more vibrant and it also handled the highlights better than the Canon. The Lumix easily performed just as well as the others and looks great, it just seems to be a little more washed out and not have the contrast of the Canon and Sony. So let's take a closer look and see if that resolution bump on the Sony is noticeable in a very detailed landscape scene like this. And I would say, not really. Even this extremely close crop shows very little advantage, and probably lens quality will make more of a difference on your image quality here than that resolution bump. I've just rounded out the landscape shoot with the 3 of the cameras and just closing thoughts, shooting landscapes in this situation. The only real thing I took away from that between the cameras, just using them, was the Sony screen is horrible compared to the Lumix and the Canon. It's just not very sharp, it's just kind of like grainy and pixelated, and the menus are horrible to find things in. Now I left that in because that was my real initial reaction to using the Sony, but I've since found out you can increase the display quality in the menu, And it has helped, but even still, the screen quality is surprisingly poor, but we'll talk about that more later in the video. Now let's take a quick look at high ISO performance in photo. Now the Lumix is benefiting from some kind of noise reduction I couldn't figure out how to turn off in the RAW converter, but they are all comparable up until around 6400 ISO, where I think the Canon begins to take the lead. The Canon just seems to hang on to colour and sharpness a little better than the other two when you get into those really high ISOs. Looking at dynamic range in photo, I shot a contrasty scene under and overexposing excessively to see how well the camera can recover highlights and shadows. All three are equally excellent when underexposing. You can really push them far with very little penalty. They all did amazing. But in terms of highlight recovery, the results are a bit more interesting, with the Sony hanging on to that fine detail in the branches a little better than the Canon and Lumix. The Canon's just missing some of that fine detail in the highlights, but I would still put the Lumix in last place here, unfortunately, as detail and colour in its image seem to suffer the most. I figured this was a good time to talk about lens image quality between the three standard zooms in this test. Of course, all three are excellent, but the Canon is exceptional in terms of sharpness and micro contrast out into the corners. The Sony is pretty much as sharp, I would say, but just doesn't have that micro contrast. The Sigma is amazing for its price, and I was seriously impressed looking at it next to these premium lenses. I also noticed the Sony suffers badly from chromatic aberration. Despite being the newer, expensive lens, it doesn't even keep up with the Sigma in this department. Overall, I really love the Canon lens for its image quality and lens stabilization. So with the photo side of the comparison done, let's move on to video. We'll start by comparing just general image quality as well as looking at the color differences between the three cameras. And later on in the video, we'll compare things like stabilization, low light performance, and dynamic range. So let's take a look at 4K 25p on each camera, starting with the Canon, which always has a more baked-in contrast thanks to that C-Log3 color profile, which makes it a nice look with minimal work, but it does suffer in dynamic range as a result. I really love the S5 image. It has a softer, more filmic look to the Canon, and V-Log is a great log curve to work with tons of dynamic range. I did struggle a little bit with dialing in the colours, often finding it quite oversaturated, as well as leaning quite heavily magenta. The Sony is like a combination of the two. It's sharp like the Canon, but without the baked-in contrast. Really easy to work with, great image and colours. Looking close up at sharpness in 25p, it's a close one between the Sony and Canon. I think the Sony probably takes the nod marginally, with the Canon just behind. The Lumix is the softer of the three, but I do prefer a softer image personally. Now moving on to 4K 50p, where I personally think the R6 MKII has the best 4K 50 on the market. No crop, super sharp and great colours. Now the Lumix does have a crop, losing us some background blur, but overall retains that same great dynamic range with just a slightly softer image still. Finally, again, the Sony has an APS-C crop, but looks great regardless, super sharp and just as good as the 25p. Looking at sharpness between the three, in 50p, it's another close call between the Canon and Sony, and this time I think I'm going to give it to the Canon marginally. The Lumix is quite a bit softer in 50p, unfortunately. Now here's a quick example of that APS-C crop in 50p on the Sony and Lumix. Right, on to stabilization. The Canon has great IBIS for static shots. I do find it kind of fights against you when moving and panning, but still it does a great job at reducing shake at the cost of some corner wobble at wider focal lengths. Now the Lumix is simply awesome. It's smooth and it works with you. It's just seriously the best IBIS I have used to date. The Sony definitely has the weakest IBIS, but benefits from zero corner wobble at any focal length. Now onto ISO performance in the three cameras, where I'm going to underexpose Rachel in this dark interior to exaggerate any noise in the shadows. Generally, the Canon performed the best in terms of noise, but at the cost of sharpness, seemingly benefiting from some internal noise reduction at higher ISOs. The Sony is similar, with just a touch more noise, but seems to retain a little more sharpness than the Canon. As we get beyond 12,800 ISO, the Sony colours begin to suffer. The Lumix is the noisiest of the three, but stays consistent with colour and sharpness, therefore has the most potential to clean up very nicely in post. Looking at video dynamic range, in shadow recovery the Canon and Sony are close with very low noise, good colours and sharpness. The Lumix shows a lot of noise in those underexposed shadows when you recover them, unfortunately. When overexposed free-stops, they all did excellent and I couldn't pick a winner between them. Generally, in terms of dynamic range and colours, I think they are all very close. I do think that the Canon clips in highlights a little earlier than the others, and the Lumix and Sony both have a much nicer highlight roll-off than the Canon. Sometimes the Sony processes colours a little strange, like the colour of the sky and grass here is much more natural on the Lumix and Canon, but despite this I do think the Sony has a really pleasing look. Let's look at overheating now, where I can confirm immediately none of these cameras overheat in 25p. I had heard reports of the Sony overheating in 50p though. I could not get the Sony to overheat. Consistently would exhaust the battery way before any signs of overheating. The Lumix battery lasts even longer and does not overheat in any 4K mode either. I have not managed to get my R6 Mark II to overheat yet. Here the battery died at just over an hour, but the temperature gauge showed it was just about to overheat. In terms of video autofocus, as a previous Lumix S1 and S5 user, Video AF was a big reason why I made the switch to Canon. Canon and Sony have such good Video AF to the point where comparing them was pretty much pointless as they were equally flawless. But has Lumix caught up? Absolutely. The S5 II is just as sticky and dependable as the others. I have yet to have it fail on me. Lumix have truly knocked it out of the park, transitioning into phase detect AF. The only room for improvement is probably in animal detection. It doesn't have a dedicated animals priority mode, only humans and animals. It also doesn't track animal eyes like the Canon and the Sony, it just puts a box around them. So let's look at build and ergonomics now, where the Canon and Sony had a more plasticky feeling of the three cameras. The Canon feels more solid, however, with the Sony just not feeling quite as well built to me. When gripping the Sony, I can feel the SD card door creaking, for example. The Lumix feels the most solid in the hands for me, with excellent build quality. I definitely prefer the Canon's smooth body to the sharp edges of the Sony and the Lumix though. It has by far the most comfortable grip and design. It has thoughtful button placement and I love this quick switch between photo and video. The Sony's grip is a little smaller than I would like and in general feels like the smaller camera in the hands with my fingers hitting the lens barrel often. It has a similar quick switch to Canon though, which I really liked. The dials are quite stiff too, and in general my biggest issue with the Sony is just how it felt to use. The Lumix has a bigger grip than the Sony, but it's still not as comfortable as the Canon. I like the intuitive controls on the top of the camera for white balance and ISO, etc. It's just not quite as intuitive and quick to swap between photo and video, however. All three cameras have dual SD card slots, but the A7IV also has the option for one of these slots to be used for CF Express. Unfortunately, the Canon has an awful micro HDMI port, whereas both the Sony and Lumix benefit from having a full-size HDMI port, which is great. The Canon has easily the best display of the three, with amazing sharpness, contrast and colours. The menus are also intuitive and really easy to figure out. The Sony simply has the worst screen of the three. It's washed out and not as sharp as the Canon and Lumix. I do think I take back my earlier comments about the Sony menus. I think they're fine. They're daunting at first, but pretty quick to get the hang of. It's annoying that picture profiles, for example, aren't labelled. It's just not quite as user-friendly as the Lumix, for example, which has a much better screen than the Sony. Not quite Canon standards, but still great. I love all the thoughtful video features like waveform and shutter angle. The menus are really easy to learn, to navigate, and are nice and intuitive. Now looking at lens build quality, the Canon and Sony feel quite plasticky in the hand, and on feel alone doesn't really give you confidence in their ability to survive a knock. I do like these little additional features on the Sony, such as the aperture ring and being able to control the zoom resistance. It also has some additional custom function buttons on the lens. However, I do prefer the inclusion of lens stabilization in the Canon and would take that over these other little features. Overall though, I have to say I was mostly impressed with the build quality of the Sigma. It feels super solid and premium in the hand. Using it made me sad to be a Canon shooter, to be honest, knowing that I'm missing out on this amazing third-party glass. So there we go. With all the tests out of the way, let me know down in the comments which of these camera systems has won you over. For me, honestly, one of the main reasons I choose to share raw files from these comparisons is hopefully so you can see for yourself just how close these camera systems truly are in terms of performance these days. For photo, if I really had to push you in any particular direction, it would probably be towards Canon or Sony. I just feel that the Canon and the Sony are slightly more photo focused first, whereas for me the Lumix is more video focused. Choosing between the Canon and the Sony will come down to things like ergonomics and lens options, whichever suits you, and I would truly recommend that you try both before committing to a system. There are some little outlier specs that may sway you one way or the other. For example, the Canon has higher burst rate shooting, so it can shoot up to 40 frames per second. The Sony can't get as quick as that, but it does have that small bump in resolution up to 30 megapixels, which can help with some very heavy cropping. I've always heard time and time again Sony criticised for its colour science, but for me I really didn't see any issues here. For video though, if you're just starting out and choosing between one of these three systems, I would probably recommend you pick up the Lumix. It's definitely a video focused first camera with amazing image quality, dynamic range, and it has all kinds of video features that you tend to only really see in cinema cameras from other brands. It has great tools like waveform, luminance spot meter, and shutter angle, which is something you don't even get in something like the FX3 from the Sony, for example. Its stabilization is absolutely best in class if you ask me. And finally, Lumix has the autofocus performance to match. And to top it off, it's cheaper than the others, so is an amazing value option. Of course, the other two are no slouches when it comes to video. I am personally a Canon shooter and I've been really happy with the R6 Mark II in terms of video. I love the Canon colours. C-Log3 is super easy to grade, it has incredible autofocus, and it has no crop in 4K 50. Some downsides are that it can overheat in 4K 50p. I hate that annoying micro HDMI slot, and you're a little bit limited when it comes to lens options. Using the Lumix and Sony as a Canon shooter makes me a little bit jealous of the amazing third-party lens options you guys get from brands like Sigma and Tamron. So if you're thinking of getting into the Canon RF mount, be warned, it's expensive, and Canon have made it very clear that right now they're not interested in working with other brands to bring these kind of lens options to the RF mount. Finally, the Sony in video is technically excellent. It has a great look, great colours, and excellent dynamic range. The downsides for me with the Sony are the crop in 4K 50p, as well as general build quality and ergonomics. It does, however, have the best range of lenses by far, as well as having a pretty great upgrade path to other video focus cameras such as the FX3 and the FX6. Thanks again for watching, and I really hope this video helps someone out there if you might be choosing between these three camera systems. It would really help if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys in the next one.